All right, let's dive right in. We're tackling one of the Bible's most, well, intense and cryptic visions, Revelation chapter 13. People have interpreted this chapter in a million different ways, but in this explainer, we're going to try to decode the vision of the beast by looking at it through a really specific historical lens. We're going to zero in on just 3 key verses that describe its reign. Let's get into it.
So these are our core verses. You've got a beast, it's speaking blasphemies, and it's waging war for a very specific amount of time. So what does it all mean? Well, the interpretation we're exploring today suggests the answers aren't in some far-off future, but they're actually anchored deep in the history of the ancient world.
And really, this leads us to the big question that's going to guide us today. Is this passage a prediction of things yet to come, or is it more like a symbolic code written for its original audience, reflecting the crazy events they were actually living through? To get to the bottom of this, we're going to break it down piece by piece.
Let's start with verse 5. This is where we get a really precise time frame for the beast's power, and it's our first major clue.
And there it is, 42 months. Now, this is not just some random number pulled out of a hat. This is the exact length of time the beast is given authority to do its thing. So you got to ask, right? Why 42? What's so special about that number?
Well, in prophetic language, this is a huge signal. See, 42 months is exactly 3.5 years, and that specific duration, it pops up again and again in biblical prophecy. It almost always symbolizes a finite period of really intense trial and persecution.
What's really interesting is how this lines up with other prophecies. This quote here is from the book of Daniel, and it describes a power that would persecute the saints for a time and times and the dividing of time. Now that's interpreted as 1 year plus 2 years plus half a year, which, hey, adds up to the very same 3.5 years. This kind of consistency across different prophecies, that's a critical clue for us.
Okay, so let's move on to verse 6, because the prophecy just keeps building. The beast gets a mouth to speak great things and blasphemies. But what are we actually talking about here? What do these blasphemies look like in the real world?
The interpretation we're looking at suggests these blasphemies weren't just, insults or disrespectful words. Nope, they were concrete, hostile actions. So the question becomes, what actions?
According to this line of thinking, these actions were specific historical events, all attributed to the Roman Empire. We're talking about the persecution of early Christians, the execution of apostles like Peter and Paul, and then ultimately a devastating act against God's dwelling on earth.
And that brings us to that word tabernacle from the text. This isn't just some abstract idea. This interpretation draws a straight line from the prophecy to the very real, very historical destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which was burned to the ground by Roman armies in the year 70 AD.
Okay, now we get to verse 7, which might just be the most chilling part of the whole passage. The beast was given power to make war with the saints and to overcome them. This gives us our third clue. Who exactly were these saints?
The word itself is actually a little tricky. If you look at the Old Testament, saints usually meant the house of Israel. But then, when you get to the New Testament, the term started to be used for Christians, the followers of Christ. So, which one is it?
Well, this particular interpretation sees the prophecy as having a kind of double meaning. The Roman Empire, our beast, it made war against both the Jewish people, which led to the Jewish-Roman War, and the early Christians during this specific time in history.
So let's recap. We have our clues: a 42-month timeline, a series of blasphemous actions, and a war against both Jewish people and Christians. Let's see how this all lines up with what we know from the history books.
This timeline here lays out the historical parallel. And you should notice the key dates. In July of 64 AD, Emperor Nero kicks off his persecution of Christians after the Great Fire of Rome. Just 2 years later, the Jewish-Roman War begins. It was, to put it lightly, a period of intense conflict.
Now, focus on the dates of Nero's persecution. It begins in the second half of 64 AD and ends with his death in June of 68 AD. If you do the math, that's a period of almost exactly 3.5 years. Or to put it another way, the 42 months from verse 5. The timing? It's a perfect match.
So here's the bottom line from this perspective. When you put all these puzzle pieces together, the wild, abstract vision from Revelation 13 suddenly starts to look like a vivid reflection of actual history. The beast is the Roman Empire, and the specific persecuting power is Emperor Nero himself.
The blasphemy, the war, they all correspond to real, documented events of the first century.
So what does all this mean? Well, this interpretation challenges us to see ancient texts like Revelation not just as predictions of the future, but as powerful commentaries on the world in which they were written. Offering hope and meaning to people who are living through unimaginable persecution.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about, one that goes way beyond this single passage. It just makes you wonder, how deeply do these two worlds, ancient prophecy and recorded history, truly intersect?